Well, I would just say, I mean, mindful of your recent engagement or re-engagement on the topic, I think some of the material that you and Chairman Sweeney discussed as follow-up material for us would be very important to have.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Kavanaugh.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry.
I just observe that, from what I understand, there were certainly conversations about how to reform TOSCA. The word reform, of course, is a word we toss around in many contexts and means, different things to different people. I just have a few questions about the standards that you would be willing to have imposed on the industry, because before, during your conversation with the chair, you asserted that government, presumably not distinguishing state and federal government, should not ban any chemical without proof of causation of harm. Is that your industry's position? Like you've asserted there should be a very high bar to ban a chemical. Did I understand that correctly?
A high bar based on the science that shows that there is a true connection between the product / chemical and the alleged issue related to that product, the related health issue related to that product.
So your position is that there should be 100% conclusive proof of causation between a particular substance and harm to human health.
I spoke earlier that the precautionary principle.
I'm not asking about the precautionary principle. I'm asking what your standard is.
Let me answer.
Okay.
So obviously, I'm not going to be in a position to say that we need 100% certainty as well. But I think there has to be sufficient science and health evidence that there is a problem. And, if I may, when there is, and we have pulled products. I think you may have missed what Jackson said earlier, that in dealing with Penta and Octa many years ago, as we saw more and more of the issues arising, we voluntarily said, hey, there is a problem here. And that was working with EPA, by the way. We said, hey, there is a problem here. We need to start backing off of this. And again, the alternative was DECA. Now, and this is where we get into the whole issue, when is the alternative safer? And then when does the alternative that was safer become a problem? And when does a new alternative become safer? It almost becomes that circular argument, and where do you cut that line?
Right, and we've seen that circular argument, and from my perspective, industry routinely substitutes products that are known to be carcinogenic or known to be endocrine disruptors in exchange for other products where the heat has been turned on in that particular product. I don't think government is suggesting that you use carcinogens very often. Again, I don't think we've gotten an answer to the question. What level of proof, what level of certainty do we need? You said the science should be sufficient. If we think it's more likely than not that a particular chemical is causing cancer in people, should that be sufficient to ban that chemical from use?
Again, as I said earlier, I think Chairman Sweeney asked a similar question. I'm not technical. I can't say what that line is, but in conversations that we will have, that is something that we will try and answer. If I could just respond to an earlier...
Actually, no, I just with respect to, because there's, I know there's a lot of witness and a lot of time, you're here testifying on behalf of an industry, and your testimony is that you think the standard for government to ban carcinogenic substances, endocrine disruptors that people are being exposed to, that we know people are being exposed to from products that your industry is putting out there, you think our standard for banning them from consumer products should be extraordinarily high, but you're not technical enough, even though you've had these conversations for years, and you've certainly been doing this for years, to articulate what level of proof that we ought to have, other than the science ought to be good and the proof ought to be very high. I just find that, that's not an answer to the question. If you're telling me you're not qualified to answer it, or you're not capable to answer it, or your industry doesn't want to answer that, that's fine. But I'm really, I just, with great respect, and we appreciate you being here to testify, but I'm not hearing you. You've said it should not be 100% certain that it's causing a particular illness. By the way, causation in environmental exposure is almost impossible to prove, as you know and I know. But you're not articulating a standard other than to say that it ought to be virtually certain, if not certain, that it's actually causing the harm before we ban it, which strikes me as an odd. We don't really apply that principle in almost any other regulatory context.
If I may just jump in quickly, I think one standard that is often used is called the weight of the evidence standard. And so you look at the weight of the overall evidence to determine what the particular determination may be for an endpoint, be it cancer or something else. And so to back up what Steve was saying, sufficiency of the evidence, weight of the evidence, I think that's probably a pretty well-defined standard that's used by government bodies and I would think by most of the companies that are members.
So we
of
have to
this.
believe that it's more weight of the evidence, meaning it's more likely than not that this substance is causing some harm in the human population.
I mean, admittedly, it's an inexact science because it's science, and so I think when you look at the weight of the evidence, you have to look at the quality of the studies. You have to look at it's not just a volume, it's quality, but you have to do an assessment.
The five chemicals that have been banned, which is an extraordinarily limited record in 36 years of this statute being in place, and I guess the last time one was banned is nearly a quarter century ago.
Can I on that issue just quickly, because Steve I think addressed some of that, but there's one other point to that because that's been discussed as well. The EPA has a new chemicals program. Any new chemical that is going to come to market has to be reviewed by EPA before it can come on the market. And so while 5 existing chemicals have been banned, there are a number of chemicals that have not been allowed to come to market.
How many?
Because they've been reviewed. I don't have a number for that. I apologize.
There are chemicals that industry proposed to use that the EPA
reviewed and said
cannot be used in any commercial context in the United States other than those 5.
That EPA said you cannot bring to the market.
Okay, I'm not aware of those. I'd be interested in
I can try and find
identifying them and the number of them. With the 5 chemicals that were banned, did the American Chemistry Council take the position that the evidence to ban those was sufficient, or did the American Chemistry Council and the industry oppose the banning of those 5 chemicals at the time they were banned?
That is way before my time. As I mentioned earlier, I've only been here 21 years. I was not around in 1976 or in
okay,
the
I believe the last of the chemicals
know.
was banned in the 90s, so it was probably right about the beginning of your time. But I mean, these are not obscure events. These were hotly contested battles between environmentalists and your industry. And since you've put out this notion that the EPA does act when it's appropriate to ban chemicals, and are examples of those in the history of America, at least banning something that was in place, are exactly 5. It strikes me as odd that we wouldn't have some sense of that. Are there any chemicals that the industry believes we should be considering banning as government? That maybe the evidence isn't quite sufficient, but there are. If you had to list chemicals that you think are in the realm of, there's growing evidence that they ought to be banned, is there any chemical that would fit that category?
Again, when you consider the 7,500 HPV chemicals, right now, I think it's impossible to say who's in and who's out. And I go back to what I stated earlier. I don't know if you were in the room. When I talked about the high standard, that high standard has to be based on the science, the available science. And again, I just learned something new regarding the weight of the evidence. Obviously, I'm an attorney. I know the standards, beyond a reasonable doubt, et cetera, those 3 standards. But I think that, again, if you look at, and this is congressional testimony that I heard a couple of years ago when phthalates was being debated, there was a scientist who was there talking about it, who had studied phthalates for about 20 years. You want to call her a bureaucrat or whatever you want to call her. She could not understand why the Consumer Product Safety Agency went ahead and banned those when she testified that those phthalates did not cause any harm to children. But yet the agency took a more precautionary approach, if that's what you want to call it, and say, "Oh, we're still going to move ahead." We believe that whenever you ban a chemical or product, that is a very drastic proposal.
Why is that drastic?
It is drastic because you are impacting way, way more than the health concerns that are being alleged against a particular product or chemical without sufficient science. And if I may, Assemblyman, you have to remember, beyond the health concerns, there are also families who work in this industry. And if we don't produce product, and if those men and women, mothers and dads who work in our industry cannot produce product, they go unemployed. Now you've created a whole new situation, which is totally different from the health issue. Now we've got people who are unemployed. Now maybe some of them can be trained into other areas, but again, I think there is a bigger picture that simply banning this cup is going to, it may solve one problem, but then it creates all these other problems that we have to address, both on our side, because what do we do with the employees, and on your side in terms of health insurance, unemployment insurance, et cetera. So there's a, please remember, there's a bigger picture here.